I think there's history here, but I don't think it's all history. And I see this regularly. I see this in lots and lots of places. And that doesn't please evangelicals who want more history, and it doesn't please a lot of skeptics who want less history.
Our guest for our July 2022 Atheist and Christian Book Club is New Testament historian Dale Allison. As you heard in the opening clip, Dr. Allison says his approach to understanding the events recorded in the New Testament upsets both evangelical Christians and ardent skeptics. What exactly are Dr. Allison's standards for judging whether or not something in the New Testament is historical? How does he or any historian know what did and did not happen 2,000 years ago in and around Jerusalem? Does Dr. Allison believe Jesus rose bodily from the dead? And what are the implications for both skeptics and believers of Allison's perspective on New Testament history? Where is history taking us? From where have we come? Where are we headed? Why am I here? Where am I going? What is my final destination? Annihilation or eternal life? And what does this enigmatic rabbi from first century Nazareth have to do with me? Whether we are atheists or believers, we all do intuitively seem to understand there is something unique about the person of Jesus Christ. Is he who the Bible says he is? Is there a trustworthy historical bridge that connects the ancient past to our present day? Can we trust what the New Testament says about Jesus' birth, death, burial, and resurrection? Are these actual historical events? Or is what really happened to Jesus lost forever to historical ambiguity? The Apostle Paul tells us that if Jesus has not been raised from the dead, then believers are among men to be most pitied. But if Jesus has been raised from the dead, that changes everything, including our final destination. Whether you believe him or not, Jesus of Nazareth is the pivotal figure of human history. Who do you say that he is? So join us for this July 2022 edition of the Atheist and Christian Book Club to see what Dale Allison has to say. Here is the president of Watchman Fellowship and the co-founder of the Atheist and Christian Book Club, James Walker.
Well, welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly get-together of both believers and skeptics, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. We typically, not always, but typically we'll do an atheist book one month and a Christian book the next month. And then we will try to discuss that. My name is James Walker. I'm the co-founder of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. I'm also the president of Watchman Fellowship, an evangelical Christian organization, apologetics group focused primarily on interfaith evangelism. I'll introduce our other co-founder in a moment, our atheist friend, Bill Cluck. But we have a very special guest author with us. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. Dr. Dale Allison. Dr. Allison is Princeton Theological Seminary professor in New Testament. He earned his MA and his PhD from Duke. His academic research is focused on historical Jesus studies, the Gospel of Matthew, the Q literature or the Sayings Gospel, early Jewish and Christian eschatology. His book, Constructing Jesus, was selected as best book related to the New Testament in 2009-2010 by the Biblical Archaeology Society. On a more popular level, he's written books on the Sermon on the Mount and on George Harrison. I hope I don't forget, because I do want to talk a little bit about George Harrison. I know it's off topic, but that was very interesting to me. He's written on religious experience in the modern world, death and what might lie beyond. He's also an ordained elder in the PC, Presbyterian Church USA denomination. He's written numerous books. The book we're going to be looking at today and discussing is called The Historical Christ and the Theological Jesus. So, Dr. Allison, welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's good, great to have you here. Our co-founder is a former Christian, now atheist, Bill Cluck. Bill and I have been friends for 6 or 7 years now. The book club's been going on for over 5 years of that time. And Bill is a definite #1 fan of Dale Allison. And Bill, we're going to let you have first shot at asking. I know you've been looking forward to this day. So do you have some questions for us?
Absolutely. And thanks for being here, Dale. By the way, can you guys see my shirt? Because I saw Jesus. Do you see it?
So bad, Bill. So bad.
Anyway,
that's the Branson, Missouri Jesus.
Yes.
The show.
I saw Jesus in Branson, Missouri at the Sight and Sound Theater. And if
you're still an atheist?
Oh, man, I tell you, it was a great show, very moving, and they did, how Christian films can be really over the top. This was really well done. They had live camels, live donkeys, and I would have loved for Dale to be there because he could have, if you look at the shirt, it has Jesus grasping Peter's hand. Do you guys see that? So that's the Jesus grasping Peter's hand. When in Matthew, the gospel that has Jesus and Matthew both walking on the water, Peter loses his faith, which 1 million sermons have been done, and Jesus grabs him out of the water. So what's nice is to actually have someone here that can answer my question, which is, and by the way, if you look in his book on page 38, he says, can historical criticism not divine, for instance, that Matthew created the story of Peter walking on the water and it intended to be not history, but parable? So I'll let him answer for himself. But what I want to know is, can we believe Matthew that Peter walked on water? Or should we believe Mark, who doesn't have Peter walking on the water, that only Jesus walked on the water? So my question, Dale, is which is historical, both, one, or none?
Okay, well, so let's just start with the fact that I think Mark is the first gospel, and I think Matthew knows Mark. And so Matthew is using Mark when he writes up this story. And it's very common in the Guild today to think that Matthew is adding this in order to make a theological point. And you will find commentators such as the great Ulrich Lutz, who thinks that when Matthew adds this, he knows the readers know that it's fictional. That is, it's a sort of Haggadic add-on like you have in rabbinic literature. Now, for me, by the way, I'm really surprised at this sentence that you quoted, because I don't remember writing that. And in later publications, I've gotten agnostic about how to decide, or if we can decide at all, what Matthew thought was historical or not historical. I think it's possible that Matthew thinks almost everything in his gospel is historical, including this, because he could have heard this story from an oral tradition and then added it on to what you have in Mark. But as an historian, even apart from questions of miracles and so on, I'm just very hesitant when it comes to a story that's attested in one text and doesn't seem to have independent attestation. So, I'm not sure how to answer your question. It's not one that I've thought about a lot. Maybe something happened, but I don't know how an historian could get a hold of it. I don't know how an historian could say, well, I can show Jesus walked on the water. I don't know how an historian could ever say, well, I can prove to you that Jesus didn't. I can't tell you how an historian could conclude, well, it probably has a rational explanation. Jesus was walking in the surf and the disciples were a ways out on the wake, and from their point of view, it looked like he was walking on the water, and so they misread it. But that's actually trying to evaluate individual miracle stories is something that I haven't done for a long, long time, because I find it an intractable business. Weird things happen in my judgment, strange things happen, but how you get at an event like this is just really difficult for an historian. If I were a skeptic, though, I would just say this one's easy. Matthew obviously made it up.
Well, yeah, and Matthew doesn't know when to quit. He has one of our favorite things as atheists is to go to the zombies coming out of the tombs, and you would believe that's not historical, obviously, right?
I think that can't be historical. And I've argued against Tom Wright, who's tried to waffle on this point. I think he's being unreasonable. But there is an interesting discussion here. So even if you decide that this is unhistorical, you could take the point of view that Mike Licona takes, which is the one Lutz takes with Peter walking on the water, which is Matthew knows this is Haggadic fiction. He's trying to make a theological point. The rabbis do this from time to time. When the rabbis said that when the manna came down, it was so high that if you climbed to the top, you could see the whole world. When they say things like that, they probably weren't being historical, right? They were just going crazy with hyperbolic parables. So the question is, does Matthew ever do that? And I personally have come to no conclusion on that. So if you look at the passage of Matthew 7, one of the interesting things is that until very recent times, all Christians, from what I can tell, thought it was historical. That is, that everybody read Matthew as though he's recounting a past event. And even somebody like Origen, who can spiritualize texts and say, well, that's not historical. He thinks this is an historical event. So, if Matthew intended it not to be, then most readers haven't gotten the point. And if you ask, are there any signals in the text itself, apart from the fact that it's outrageous, that this is different than the material around it? That is not at all clear to me. So
well, what I'll do, Dale, is next time I go to Branson, I'll tell him to leave out that part, okay? Jesus walk and change the t-shirt. Anyway, speaking of historical...
Hey, before you ask us another question, I want you to ask the questions, but I just forget to say this. I'm going to come back with some questions too when Bill's done, but for the rest of our club, if you have a question or want to make a comment or something like that, if you'll just text our moderators, Brady and Daniel, they'll just let them know that you want the mic, and we'll get you worked in the order that you ask. So just wanted to do that housekeeping. So Bill, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So speaking of historical, William Lane Craig, one of the foremost Christian apologists, has just come out of the book In Search of the Quest for Adam, where he says what we're looking at is mytho-history. Obviously, Genesis 1 and 2 contradict each other. Obviously, they get everything wrong in the order they have the plants coming too early on day 3. They have dinosaurs and man at the same time. And when dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, the first thing that looks like a Homo comes 6 million years ago. So that's wrong. So, but here's the problem is if you believe like William Lane Craig does now, that there was never an original Adam. The Homo sapien population never got below 2,000. Populations involved, not individuals. So if you don't have a first Adam, that impacts the atonement, because what does Paul say? That Adam was the first one where sin came into the world. Jesus came and did away with sin. So without a foundation, can you have a viable Christian faith without a foundation in Genesis?
Wow. Okay. So now you're asking me not to play historian, but theologian. And well, look, I tell people I'm a garage theologian. What I mean by that is that when I was growing up, we had garage bands, and there were high school students after school that, played their guitars and drums, and, they weren't professional, but they enjoyed it and they spent lots of hours at it. So I'm not a professional theologian, but I haven't thought of a question like that. I have to be honest, in decades. So I decided a long time ago that Genesis is not history, but it's something else. And so it has to be interpreted as metaphor or parable or mytho-history or something like that. If you're asking, does Paul himself think there was a real Adam? Yes, I think he does. I think he read it as most Christians have read it down through the ages. So you have to look, this is the origin of liberal Protestantism, isn't it? That is, you have traditional doctrines, and then you have new knowledge, and there seems to be some conflict. So you rethink them and refine them, and so on. And that's what's going to happen with Bill Craig or anybody else who's thinking about the atonement and wondering if this depends upon Adam. I mean, you just have me, because I haven't thought about an historical Adam in decades. So I have nothing to say about it.
Yeah, it impacts the atonement, because if you have death and disease 65 million years ago, where dinosaurs are killing each other and you have thorns and so forth, what it does, it impacts the atonement. Why did Jesus have to die if death and disease is the natural matter of things?
Yeah. So it depends on what is natural. And here, I don't want to play theologian. There are very sophisticated theologians who would argue that God created a good world and something went wrong with it, and that's all you need to end up with the way Paul is thinking. You don't need the details of Genesis and so on.
Well, okay, let me go to another direction. Ken Daniels mentioned your name, and man, I was off and running. So I read your book, Jesus, the Millenarian Prophet, and I'm going, Apocalyptic Jesus, hello. He was a misguided apocalyptic prophet who had a bad weekend in Jerusalem. And sure enough, I look at Bart Ehrman, and Bart has written the book Jesus, Prophet of the new millennium. And you both are supreme scholars who believe the best, and this is ever since Albert Schweitzer and pretty much the last 20 years of scholarship, that we best understand Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet. So I'm watching Myth Vision, which you've been on with Derek, right? And who appears but John Dominic Crossan? So I am really settled in my faith of apocalyptic Jesus. And then he goes, oh no. He goes, look at John the Baptist, who's the greatest of them all, apocalyptic thought, but the least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. Plus, he says that the Jews were burnt out from the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. Apocalypticism was just burnt out. So my question to you is, to help my faith, is should I look at Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet, or as Dom does, as a cynic, social reformer? You tell me.
Okay, well, look, we've had our debates, okay? I've had my debates with Crossan. We actually produced a book a number of years ago. I'm not sure what the name of the book is, but I presented my view, he presented his view, I presented my view in response to him, he responded to me, and so on. So it was a back and forth book. And obviously, since you're talking to me, I must be right.
Yeah,
I'm not going to tell you that he's right. I will say this. I do think it's fair to say that over the years, I've written a lot about this, and it all sort of culminated in a book called Constructing Jesus, which appeared in 2010. And I do not know of anyone who has seriously challenged the main thesis I have there about eschatology. I don't know of anyone. Dom's repeating views. Dom's very smart. I like him, but I just think he's completely out to lunch on this. He's just wrong. Dom thinks Jesus proclaimed a so-called sapiential kingdom, a kingdom of wisdom, and he views Jesus as a sort of social reformer. I think Jesus is more mainstream Jewish apocalyptic, and I think everything points to that. Absolutely everything. Dom has to argue that Jesus had two stages, because he knows, since Jesus submitted to John's baptism, he must have adhered to what he was saying. So he's got to find a couple of sayings which he can interpret as though Jesus now goes a different way, but I don't find it convincing.
Okay, last question. Let's just get to the bottom line here. You say in your book, was it Jesus the Millenarian Prophet, I think, that Resurrecting Jesus, that Jesus was wrong. Jesus clearly predicted that you will see the Son of Man coming, and you will see him before you go to all the towns of Israel. It didn't happen. And I appreciate what we really love about you, Dale, is your honesty to say Jesus was wrong. He was a misguided apocalyptic prophet. But with that being, with you having no foundation in Genesis for your faith, when you have nothing in his, we know Abraham, this stuff doesn't get historical to David, if even that you have serious contradictions in the gospel narratives. With all that, tell me 0 to 100%, what's the chance that Jesus is God, that our Orthodox view is right? What's the chances it's correct?
Okay, let me see how I can answer that question. So you want me to talk about theology in terms of statistics and percentages?
Exactly, because see, people have to make a decision. Do we tithe? Do we go to wake up at 8:30 and go to church, or go to a hip church at 11 o'clock and be cool?
Okay.
That really doesn't matter what you believe there in these Hillsong churches, because everybody's just cool anyway. But what I'm saying is people have to make a decision, and obviously I'm giving it 10% chance. Okay, I mean, Swinburne in London gives it 99% chance. Okay, so that's kind of insane. So you tell me what you think.
So I don't think you can address this sort of issue in the abstract. I think that when you're evaluating historical events, you're going to have to go back to philosophical issues. You're going to have to go back to presuppositions. You're going to have to go back to what you otherwise believe, correct? Now, I have a new book called The Resurrection of Jesus, which came out 2020. And it's clear there that I am a believer, but I'm not an ordinary believer. So I'm a believer that has doubts and questions and doesn't know what to do with the empty tomb, if it was empty, and has all sorts of odd ideas as to what visions are. So I'm not a theologian. And what that means is that I have the freedom to explore questions, and I've been exploring them my whole life, and I don't expect to answer them on this side of death, all right? So I would like God to have raised Jesus from the dead, because I love the Sermon on the Mount. I like the guy in the Gospels very much. I like happy endings. I have lots of reasons for rooting for that side, all right? But in this book, I argue that the apologists are wrong and the skeptics are wrong. That is, you cannot. So here I disagree with lots and lots of people. But I think judging this as an historical fact in isolation doesn't make any sense. And if you're honest, it's going to depend on other sorts of inclinations you have, other sorts of beliefs you have, religious orientations. I have a number of I've finally written about this. My latest book is called Encountering Mystery: Religious Experience in the Modern World. If you want to know who I am, that's the book. All right. And so it's my experience, which I then interpret in terms of history of religion, other people's experience, and so on. I try to be honest with the data. It's the person I am because of what I think about certain experiences that makes me open to possibilities that maybe you wouldn't be open to. All right. But I'm also, as an historian, I'm not going to get into percentages. There are maybe 3 pages in that book on Bayesian statistics. And I just say, no, this isn't what I do. This isn't how things work, at least in my universe. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. So I don't know how to answer this. It's the kind of question. This is the kind of question that when people write me and ask me, I say, that's the question for me anyway, maybe not for others, but for me, it's a question of a lifetime. And I'm still on a journey. I started this journey as a teenager, and I'm still thinking through it. I wrote about the resurrection in a book in the 80s, then in a book in the early 2000s. Then I came out with this other book recently, which is a huge thing. If this were a settled issue for me and I understood everything, I wouldn't keep returning to it, and my excursions wouldn't keep getting longer and longer and longer.
Well, hey, thanks, Dale. And I know your disciple, Ken Daniels, I can't wait to hear what he has to say.
Hey, Dale, we do appreciate you so much being here. Now, I'm of the conservative Christian. And in fact, some people accuse me of being more conservative than God, which I don't even know what that means. But, in school, we had to study Bultmann and Jesus Seminar and that kind of thing. But it was the idea was you study it kind of like an immunologist would study COVID. The goal is not to catch it, but to find the cure. So that's the approach that we were getting on that. And not until I read your book had I really deeply thought about this, because I never really thought about the tension between the demythologizers, Rolf Bultmann and later Paul Tillich and the theologians of the 20th century, and the tension between them and the more liberal manifestations of historical Jesus, like you find with Funk and the Jesus Seminar people. I always thought it was two approaches to accomplish the same goal. The goal is to remove the supernatural from the Bible and the deity from Jesus. So there's two ways of accomplishing the same thing. But in reading your book, I'm realizing that is oversimplistic at best, if not a complete misunderstanding, perhaps. Why is there, do you think, this tension between doing history, those that are doing the history and those that are doing theology, especially if they are kind of maybe similar in their theology, maybe more liberal in their theology, but there's this tension you bring out in the book between the historian and the theologian. Can you go into that?
Yes. Well, so to be cynical, we all have our jobs to do, and theologians don't want to hand their job over to the historians, right? And they still want to have something to do at the end of the day. And if theology beyond that is just trying to digest or interact with or figure out what the historians have said this decade, you know that they're going to say something different the next decade. And so it looks like it's shifting sand. It looks like it's not a foundation. So Barth understood this. I'm not a Barthian. And Tillich understood it. I'm not a Tillichian, but I understand what they were doing. And Bultmann was the same way. So Bultmann did his history. He even wrote a little book on Jesus. The first chapter of his New Testament theology is about Jesus, but he knows enough to know that history is unstable and that new discoveries change things and new insights change things. And so he thinks, gosh, Jesus existed, he was crucified. That's all I need to do my theology. He's just very different than other people who think that they can build theology on history. As I think I might say in this book, when I started out, I really did have this great faith in history, which in retrospect was faith in historians. And now that I've been a practicing historian for several decades, I know who we are, right? I don't stand in awe of us from the outside and say, okay, they're going to give us the answers, because I'm supposed to be an answer man and I still have lots of questions. So I understand this. If you're a theologian, you're looking for something more solid, and it might be the text. So for Barth, it's the text, because the text doesn't change, right? I mean, you might have an updated Greek edition of the New Testament, but it's not radically different. But Barnard's Jesus is not Albert Schweitzer's Jesus, and Crossan's Jesus isn't Tom Wright's Jesus. And it's just the fact that the historians are always battling with each other. I think that's part of it. So understand it.
That's one of the things I liked about the book also. You did a really good job of explaining the challenge and your disdain for hearing, modern scholarship. Now we now know for sure X, Y, or Z, which you did a great job of showing. No, we don't. In fact, it was almost pessimistic. Maybe you would say realistic. I don't know, but this idea that decades and decades of historical Jesus studies, have we really come to any definitive conclusions? And will those conclusions, what's the shelf life on them? Is it good for 5 to 10 years, and then they're going to be replaced by other assured scholarly conclusions? So it's now that's a decade and a half ago you wrote this book. So in the meantime, have you become more optimistic about historical Jesus studies, or I'll say more realistic?
No. I don't think that I changed my mind a lot. I am actually right now in the middle of what has to be I pray to God, my last book on Jesus. But what happened in 2010 is I produced a book where I tried to make large conclusions about Jesus, come to lots of conclusions without using the so-called criteria of authenticity, about which I had become a sort of skeptic. And after that book came out, a lot of people appreciated it and had got on board, but I have lots of critics and I don't want to ignore them. And right now I am paying attention to my critics, trying to think through their criticisms and decide what's valid. And at points where it's valid, I need to rethink things. But that just underlies the whole problem here, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I hate the word consensus. I probably said that in the book. I hate this word because the consensus just isn't going to be the same in 10 years from now. So who cares, right? And how do you get it anyway? I've never understood how you count heads, or who does the counting, which heads count, right?
Yeah.
It just,
that's one thing, and you brought out as well with the Jesus seminar. Their success was really how they worked the media. And so that comes across by the time Time Magazine deals with it, or the New York Times. This is the consensus of biblical scholarship, modern biblical scholarship, is the Jesus seminar. And so they're voting on, which sayings Jesus said, and you find out that, most of the Gospels is either going to be black or gray, very little red letter actual words of Jesus. So, but that, as you pointed out in your book, was not all of scholarship, and was just a very narrow part of that scholarship. And even Jesus seminar, that's pretty passe now. That's kind of gone with the wind.
So let me briefly tell you that I don't know, 15 years ago or so, I was invited to the Jesus seminar because I have an eschatological Jesus and they had a non-eschatological Jesus, and they wanted a debate. So I went and we had a debate. And then, as you know, when you're done discussing, you cast votes, right? And you have the red beads and the black beads and so on. And I think the question was Jesus an apocalyptic prophet? And when they had voted on this 10, 15 years before that, most of the beads were black. But after I got done talking and having the debate, I was very flattered that the number of red and pinks went up and the number of blacks and grays went down. And it just tells you, okay, so they voted, and their voting results are different, in the 1990s than they are in the 2000s, early 2000s. So what does that tell you about the consensus? They don't even have a consensus within their own group.
One of our earlier authors this year, actually, he's been a guest a couple of times at the Atheist and Christian Book Club. It was Robert Price, who was also a fellow of the Jesus Seminar. Has an interesting story of why he's no longer part of that. But the bottom line is he's a full-fledged mythicist now. And so the irony of, going down to vote on which sayings Jesus did say and didn't say when there was no historical Jesus. Now, he did point out to us that was a position he had not fully embraced for part of the time he was at the Jesus, a fellow of the Jesus seminar. So maybe, but his argument was that their research stopped too early. It wasn't just some of the sayings of Jesus. The whole Jesus man there's not a leg to stand on. So we had a whole 2-hour book club where he gave reasons for that. So, but again, it's this idea of, has scholarship arrived? What benefit have we gotten out of historical Jesus? Let me ask the question that way.
What benefit have we gotten out of it? I think we have a better idea of how the Gospels came to be. My own view is that old-fashioned harmonizers, just ever since David Friedrich Strauss in the 19th century, I think I think their cause is lost. Okay, so that's one of the things we've learned. Maybe the most valuable thing we have learned is that if we're thinking in terms of the first century, that we have to interpret these texts, first of all, not in terms of the Christian theological tradition, but in terms of first century Judaism and the people of the time. Everyone understands that when it comes to archaeology, right? You want to understand how this story fits into the archaeology of Jerusalem or Galilee or whatever. But we have lots and lots of texts which people didn't have access to 200 years ago or more, texts from the first century, texts which I think shed incredible light on questions like, what did Jesus mean by kingdom of God? What might he have meant by Son of Man? And so on. So I think
definitely on the background and historical context, you know, there have been numerous very good developments in that area, so no doubt about that. But as far as getting to those core things, Crossan says, you know, one thing, another historian says the other, and it's you know, is this something that can be in your book? You said nothing I don't have a page number, I was using the Kindle edition, but it's nothing compels us to concur with the fundamentalists in insisting, along with, ironically, the anti-ecclesiastical polemicists, that if Jesus and Peter did not literally walk on the waves, then Matthew 14 signifies nothing. And your comment was such a hermeneutical move is unsophisticated and unimaginative, and we should reject it. So if it didn't happen historically, then what you're saying is that doesn't mean it doesn't have value.
Yes. So there I'm speaking as a guy who goes to church and who hears sermons. And I don't want the pastor to get up and say, well, I've been reading a lot and I've decided this story didn't happen. Therefore, I'm not going to preach on it anymore. I'm only going to preach on the stories that I can show really happened. The truth is that if you're a Christian, you belong to a tradition. All these texts have been preached on. And I think if you belong to this club, to this tradition, it's your job to make sense of the text, whether they're historical or not. So,
would you agree, though, that some gospel claims require at least some type of corresponding historical content?
Yeah, of course. So I think I said
the example, though. That's what I want to quote you, because you do say that in the book. And what you said earlier, in fact, this is later in the book, but actually, earlier in the book, I'm sorry, you mentioned the Apostles' Creed, and you quoted suffered under Pontius Pilate. But then you said this: if there was no Jesus of Nazareth who died between the years 26 and 37 AD, when Pilate was in Judea, then something thought to be importantly true would be indisputably false. Mm-hmm. So, like, and again, Bill was trying to make a big deal out of the walking on the water too, but it seems like some historical claims, and maybe even some miracle claims, are like dispensable, or they are expendable perhaps, but others might be more essential. Can we live with a Jesus who never walked on water, but what about a Jesus who died and stayed dead, or perhaps only rose again in the hearts and desires of his disciples? So what would you say are some of the like more essential either miracles or even just historical claims that you've got to find some way to make that true on some level, or you end up gutting Christianity?
Well, I think Jesus had to be a good person. He had to be a saintly individual. I think without that, you don't have anything. I think you have to have something like what you would call the gist of his character and the core meaning of his sentences. And then I think you have to have the crucifixion, and then I think you have to have the resurrection, although I've spent a lifetime trying to figure out exactly how I want to interpret or approach the resurrection. But if I were to say, or if you were to say, well, I decided that the tomb was empty and the disciples made it up. They just went back to Galilee and they wanted to stay in business, and they thought this religious thing gave them free food, so they were going to keep it going. Then I'd say, let's go study Buddhism, or let's study the Christian tradition and ask no historical questions at all, at least about the New Testament. Because
in other religions, the historicity is really not essential at all. The truth is in the sayings or the practice itself, and it doesn't tie to whether there was really a historical Buddha or what have you. But at least it seems like that there is a corresponding necessity for at least some of the content of the Gospels to be historical, and even some miracles. Like we can lose the walking on water or healing the dead man, but we have to have Jesus, don't we? Doesn't he have to rise somehow, in some way, survive the grave?
For me, yes. For me, the answer is yes. But one of the things I thought in the chapter was say, there is this great space between Bultmann, right, which is he was crucified, and everything is absolute history just as it stands. There is this great span between there, and the question is where you need to be on the spectrum. And I said there are some things that I think are you have to believe to stay in the club, but people would disagree with me as to what those are. So a long time ago, I decided that Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2 are history. So I do think about them in very different ways than I think about the material, other material in the gospel.
You mean the first two chapters?
First two chapters of Matthew and first two chapters of Luke, the so-called infancy narratives, right? I don't find a lot of history in those. I just don't. But for many people, on theological grounds, it's very important that there be historical basis to those stories. The virgin birth is part of the creed, for example, so it becomes very important. I'm just a more liberal Christian on that point.
You are an enigma. Let me say this. I really enjoyed your book. You raised a lot of good questions. I really enjoy. This is what we try to do at the book club. Is the positions we disagree with, like atheism, we try to steel man it and not straw man it, and really hear some of the best. I've had the dubious privilege of hearing some of the best arguments against Christianity over the last 5 years. And I try to really understand the arguments, and it's clear from your book that you are not making a caricature. You're trying to play real fair with all the data and information, and you're transparent about your own struggles, and I really appreciate that. But one of the dilemmas we have is, okay, we have quite a few requests for over a year. We've had requests to try to get you as an author in our book club. But to be honest with you, all the requests are coming from the atheists. And so I say, and I wanted to hear you too, but I said, I don't want to count this as a Christian book though, because I want to have a month of Christian book next. So it was a big debate. Do we count this as an atheist book, as a Christian book? And I kind of thought, well, no, I think it's written fairly enough that maybe you can make both sides upset, but also bring some things to light for both sides of us. So maybe it's a book that's so fairly written.
The first time in club history, we had a draw. You're not Christian or atheist.
So I honestly don't understand this. The last chapter of the book you read is as pious as you can get.
Well, yeah, and I agree. And your credentials, you're an ordained minister of the PCUSA. So again, it's just an enigma because of the requests that we're getting from the atheists and things like that. But maybe a more positive way of saying it is you're going to please both sides in one way or another. And again,
no. You can't please both sides.
Well, no, in places you do. In places you do, because no matter how much I think the atheists disagree with you on issues, they're going to agree with you in places. And I find myself over and over again saying, well, okay, yes, I agree with that. I agree with that. I agree with that. So you give something of value to everybody in the room, I think.
Yeah, okay, we're historicists, atheists here, Dale. We believe there was a Jesus historically, and that there was a John the Baptist, which gets us close to Jesus.
Yeah, I was just going to say, look, I'm getting really old now, so my pop culture references don't work for anyone. But there was an old singer in the 50s, 60s named Rick Nelson. And he sang a song, you can't please everyone, so you got to please yourself. So I decided that a long time ago. And I write books for myself. That is, if you were to ask me, why did I write this book? Well, it's because I had these questions. And that's why I write every book. I don't sit out with an answer before I write a book. That would be really boring, right? I write books because I'm not sure what I think. And the way I think is by writing, correct?
Yeah, and I like the way that you say, this is why I've arrived at this decision, but this is how I struggled through it. You didn't just tell us, here's the answer. And I think that's why Bill was a little frustrated. He just wants to know the answer. And what you do as a good job is explaining the whole journey and say, this is why it's kind of difficult to get from A to B, because you're going to have to answer these questions along that path. And that's that's one of the things I really liked about your book.
Okay, well, I appreciate it, but one of the problems with coming on a show like this is people ask you questions and you end up thinking maybe you know something or you are an authority, but I'm just a person. I'm just a human being struggling through life like everybody else, trying to make sense of it. And I think I see some things, and since I have an area of specialty, maybe I can share some things I've learned, but I'm not an oracle and I'm not an authority. If you lived inside my head, you would know that's true. I am no oracle to myself. I'm just a guy who says, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure what the answer is. What is
Bill,
it?
I've got some more questions for you if I get some time, but I'm going to let some other people ask some questions. I know there's a lot of people lined up here that have questions for you. I've seen some of the scrolls spin by real fast, but Daniel or Brady, do we have somebody queued up next to talk with them?
Yeah, I have one, and then I'll lead into our first guest question. Dale, I appreciated your candor. I understand what you're expressing when you write. I had a book project come out a couple of years ago, and I wasn't sure how my chapter was going to turn out exactly. I was a contributor, but I love writing, and I find sometimes at the end of what I write, I'm like, oh, that's what I really think.
Yeah.
So I understand that process, and I appreciate you being candid about that as a writer. And I think that's something that, unless you try to write, that may not be something that people fully understand, but I appreciate that. So thank you for sharing. I wanted to get maybe an oddball question and answer whatever part of it you want. Really, I'm going to put it in kind of a 3 and pick whatever one you want to talk about. And I won't demand that you answer all of it or comment on everything. It's interesting. Now we are 2,000 years away from the resurrection that were, according to church tradition and the scriptures, that were attested to by apostolic authority. In other words, the apostles were people that saw Jesus alive after the resurrection. And, now we're 2,000 years later talking about who wrote these things, what did they mean? How did we come to understand this tradition that we have in the Gospels? I was curious, and this would just be an opinion, of course, of what you think. What would you think of what people would be talking about in regards to the moon landing 2,000 years from now? It's not, maybe, I know that's hard to think about, but 12 men walked on the moon, and maybe 2,000 years from now, people will go, that didn't happen, or we're discussing that. So as a historian, I was wondering if you could just kind of offer your opinion there. But if you don't want to touch that one, I got a couple other ones. One would be more basic, like, what is your historical epistemology? In other words, when you look at history in the past, how do you extract something and pronounce it with some level of confidence that something did or did not happen? So what kind of, if you want to be brief about that, what is your epistemic methodology in examining history, and how do you approach that question of how do we know what we know in the past? And then if you could too, and if you don't have to talk about this if you don't want to, but what's the distinguishing characteristics between, how do you separate history and theology? I think it was Martin Luther who said everybody's a theologian. And so I've had this conversation with Michael Licona when I was in grad school. How do we separate history from theology from your vantage point? So those are the 3 things, and that might be all I say tonight. So that's why I put them all out there, and you can address one or none of them or whatever you'd like.
So the first question had to do with the moon landing. Are you thinking that maybe 2,000 years from now we'll have some mythicists and think there was?
We have them now. We have them now.
Yeah, I was going to say that we've already had them.
Right,
correct?
right. Yes,
Well, they're
yes,
very
yeah.
unconvincing, and I don't find them any more convincing than the mythicists about Jesus. And I don't see why they should have any more credibility 2,000 years from now. We will probably have gone to the moon and beyond, and everybody will just look back. And of course, that was the first step. Historical epistemology, that's a really good question. And if I weren't answering off the top of my head, I don't know what I would say. But in this format, I have to answer off the top of my head. So I have to say the first thing that comes to mind.
No, that's fine.
And I think the way I think is through parallels. So I'm always, as an historian, I'm always looking for parallels, and parallels to me make something credible. If I'm dealing with something that's totally a singularity, I don't know how to understand it. So in the book on Jesus as millenarian prophet, there's a lot of comparative stuff about different people, different prophetic movements, different people who have hope for the end, and so on, lots of Jewish messiahs and so on. So I'm always looking for parallels. The book on the resurrection has a middle section, which is the most important part, which is called Thinking with Parallels. And I don't think parallels explain away everything in the New Testament, but it's the only way I can get beyond Sunday school. So Sunday school just says this happened, this has happened, this happened. The only way to analyze that is to ask, are there parallels? What sort are the parallels? What do these parallels tell us, and so on? And that's what I'm always doing. I'm always looking for history of religion parallels. I'm always looking for Jewish parallels. I'm always looking for Greco-Roman parallels. I'm looking for rabbinic parallels, and so on and so on. So that's how I contextualize my texts. I'm always looking for something that's similar to them. And if I have enough data, then maybe I can make a judgment. Now, I know that's very, very abstract, but I think that's who I am, and that's how I operate. Whenever I'm looking at something, I'm asking, what does this remind me of? Do I know anything else like it? And if it reminds me of something else, do I know more about that than I know about what I'm looking at, so that it can shed light on that? Okay.
Okay.
Hey, Dale, you do believe in the criteria of embarrassment? You know, Jesus being baptized by John, we can believe that's historical because of it's embarrassing. Do you believe those criteria and multiple attestation?
So my problem with the so-called criterion of dissimilarity is not that it's irrational. I just don't think it covers that much material. So but I would also formulate it a different way. I would simply say there are things in the Gospels for which it is hard to tell a good story if they didn't happen, or if there's not some historical root. So I don't think you could tell a good story by which Christians decide to have their Savior baptized by John the Baptist. And there are certainly other things in the Gospels. Jesus's family in Mark 3 thinks he's insane or out of his mind, or people say he's a friend of sinners, he's a glutton. There are things like that I just think were made up, all right? So if you want to call that authenticating things by the criterion of embarrassment, that's okay. I just think it's much more limited than a lot of people make it out to be. So does that answer that question, Bill?
Yeah, let me ask real quick. We have two traditions. Judas in Matthew, whatever, dies by hanging, and then we go to Acts, and Judas dies by falling off a cliff. Two contradictory accounts, but we do have common things like the 30 pieces of silver, the field of blood, and so forth. So I've been dying to ask this. Can we believe in a historical Jesus? Can we believe that there was a Judas, even though we have contradictory accounts?
Okay, so actually there are three accounts. There's also an account in Papias. There's an account in Papias where he gets run over by a wagon, all right? So what you can do is you can harmonize these things. So he hung himself, and the rope broke, and then his guts spilled out, after which he was run over by a wagon. So you can put them all together if you want to. When I look at it, what I think is there was an historical Judas, but I'm not sure the early Christians knew what happened to him. And if you know anything about ancient literature, it's very common when people are bad, that they come to really bad endings. All right. That's just how they get written up. So I don't know what happened. Maybe one of them has a memory, but my inclination would be to say that Judas handed over Jesus and probably just disappeared, right? Well, why would anyone know what happened to him? And then they guess that something bad must have happened, and that's where we get these three stories. By the way, that's one of the reasons why nobody likes me, what I just said. So I think there's history here, but I don't think it's all history. And I see this regularly. I see this in lots and lots of places, and that doesn't please evangelicals who want more history, and it doesn't please a lot of skeptics who want less history. But I think we have this sort of combination in a number of places. The last one was separating history and theology.
Sure.
And I can give that just a short introduction without elaborating. But for me, what that means is sitting at a desk and trying to look at the data and say, what does the data say, whether I want it to say that or not? And I have very distinct memories of doing this at times, saying, I'd like it to say A, but damn it, it says B. So I need to go there. And the thing I want is usually theologically driven. So that's how I separate them while I'm working. And then eventually I try to bring them back together, but only after I have my history constructed.
Okay. Oh, that's fair. Thank you for that top of the head answer, Dale. Appreciate that. We are going to get into the to our gallery of friends who have lots of good questions lined up.
Sean Mixon is next on our list. Sean.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Allison. I did have a question. My background is in philosophy, and there's a it seems to me to be a tremendous gap between probability and truth. And I see a lot of historians using likelihoods, and this is probably the most likely thing to have happened. And as you said several minutes ago, history is not the type of thing you can put on probabilities, numerical values. So it seems to be subjective. And that when I think about the subjectivity of it all and the sheer amount of speculation, and then even if you're right about something being more probable than not, it still doesn't follow that whatever was more probable is actually what actually occurred, because improbable things often occur. One example is the lottery. So how as a historian, if you I think I watched you in several interviews and listen to you speak and read some of your vast work. But so how does that sit with you? Is that something that stresses you out? Because even after you come to what's most probable, it could still not even be true.
So look, I think the answer to that is no. There may be some sort of psychological explanation having to do with my mother or my upbringing. I just don't need certainty. I've somehow learned to live with questions and uncertainty. I think it has something to do actually with my faith. So despite a misapprehension, I'm not an atheist, and I have faith in God, and I think everything will work out in the end. All right. And I have no illusions that I'm going to figure everything out. So for me, that's part of actually divine grace. If God is expecting us to figure things out, then we're all in trouble because we disagree about everything, right? Okay, now that's just the personal thing. But if you want a more historical answer, I think in terms of 5 categories. So I can't, so Bill wanted a percentage. Gosh, I never give percentages, but what I think is that my judgments tend to fall into 5 categories. So there's the highly probable, there's the probable, there's the I can't figure it out, it's 50-50, there's the improbable, and there's the highly improbable. Those are the 5 categories, and I'm usually sticking things into one of those 5 categories. And not one of them is the certain truth. But again, for reasons I don't know, it doesn't bother me. I know there are lots of people who need to know or need certainty.
But what does probable mean to you? Because it has no objective definition, and this is a problem. So to say that it's highly probable, how are you not just saying this makes me feel good?
Makes me feel good. No. I think that means that it's a really, really good explanation of the data. Okay, doesn't mean it's true. Pardon?
Isn't that subject? That's a relative.
Yes. Okay, so yes, it is subjective. I think a lot of history is subjective. I don't see there's any way to get around that. Okay. In fact, in one of my books at one point, I said, we're a bit like artists. All right. We're not scientists. And one of the problems with the Jesus Seminar is it tried to turn judgments into numbers, and they got their B's and they did the statistics and all the rest. And I don't think anything good or helpful came from that. I think most of us know what it's like to say that's really highly probable, and that's really, really improbable. And then there are these other things between, but it's all explanation for data. That's how I'm thinking. And I don't think I'm thinking mathematically, but if you forced me to, maybe I would say, well, 75 to 100 is highly probable, 50 to 70. I don't know. Maybe I could do something like that. But as a matter of fact, that is not what I do. All right. And there are times where I just say, I can't decide. The evidence on both sides is pretty good. And that's history. Just have to live with it.
But here's the problem, Dale, is the Christian fundamentalists cannot live with tension. They cannot live with uncertainty. They have to have it 100% or forget it. And that's what caused me to leave the church, okay? Because I was a Christian, and Ken, I want you to comment on this too, is if we had known you, Dale, we might still be Christians.
Well, so my social location has never been in the vicinity of fundamentalists. I was just raised in the middle of the road to liberal Protestant church. I had a little period with evangelicals. So I went to a secular university. I went to Duke. I just haven't been around many fundamentalists.
But wait a minute, doesn't Presbyterianism equal Calvinism? They're the most hardcore people you'll ever meet.
PCA versus PCUSA, Bill.
Yeah,
it's not.
Oh, I'm sorry, my bad.
Sure. If you go back to the old Calvinists, sure, but I'm not an old Calvinist. I dislike them very much. I grew up with the lukewarm, mamsy-pamsy, the milk toast Presbyterians who didn't believe much of anything, right? They were boring.
So, Ken, do you have a comment since you led me to?
Let me introduce Ken to you for just a second. Is it Ken's turn?
Well, I mean, we're going in order, but
I think there were others before me that I'd be glad to have go before me.
Yeah. This is why Ken is so likable. He's like, hey, let's stay in line. Ken keeps to the rules.
Sorry
Thank you,
Mike
Ken.
is Mike Cahill is next.
Okay, just a couple of comments. I was also raised in the namby-pamby PCUSA and have exited that. I don't know what that says about anything, but I just thought I'd throw it in. My undergraduate degree was biochemistry, and at least a lot of the science has progressed in really measurable progress. I mean, we know what the structure of DNA is now, for example, which we didn't a century ago. Well, it's getting almost that long, not quite. There's a lot of hard science that has made good progress there. I'm now a linguist. I'm investigating other languages in the world, and we're finding out things about languages and cultures that we didn't know before. And so that there's some other examples of disciplines that are like that. We could say this is progress. We know something that we didn't know before. And it seems to me like theology and philosophy are not in that same kind of category because you don't have as much hard data to go by. So my question that I posted in here is new theology any better than old theology? And if so, what can we actually base this on? Because it seems like the old ideas just keep recycling around. Now, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a theologian, but it seems like there's a real different category difference between the kind of disciplines that have what you might call hard data to go by. And I would put history, I'm not a historian either, but it seems like history is kind of in the middle on some of that. But I'd just like to comment on like, what are, and you actually mentioned this a little bit in your book about, just because something is new doesn't mean it's right. But just to comment on kind of the things of just the new versus the old and how much we can actually, what impact it has just because it's new versus whatever else you'd like to comment on.
Well, so I guess I agree with you. The history's sort of in the middle. If you want to think that theology and philosophy don't make any progress, but the philosophers and the theologians, I'm sure, would want to debate that. And I'm sure they would, right? I'm sure they would. And I do read theological writings that make me think new thoughts, okay? People have different points of view and say things that weren't said before. And I'm sure that it's the same thing with philosophy. My son is a philosopher, and among other things, and he's always reading a new book and telling me about it, and it gives him a new point of view on something. So I'm not going to be cynical there, okay? But I can't speak. As I said, I'm a garage theologian at best, and I'm not even a garage philosopher, right? I might read one philosophy book a year, so I can't keep up.
Yeah. Can I a follow-up that was based on an earlier thing when we were talking about Peter walking on the water? As a historian, how would you evaluate that? I mean, the criteria that one person mentions it and the other one doesn't means that it didn't happen is a logical fallacy, of course. And then there's people who say, well, of course it did happen because it's in the Bible. And then people say, of course it didn't because that's miraculous, so we don't believe in miracles. So it seems, and this is another point you make in your book, that people's presuppositions and prior philosophies often have an awful lot to do with how they judge the truth or veracity of a particular claim there. So how would you as a historian actually approach that particular instance?
As an historian, I would simply give up. I would say, I don't know what's behind this. Well, look, I'm being honest here. I don't know what's behind this story. Now, the truth is that if you think, let's say, as an historian, you argue like Richard Bauckham, for example, you argue that Mark is mostly eyewitness testimony from Peter via Mark, right, his interpreter. If you think that Mark is mostly history, then you could say, well, I think this is Mark, so it probably has history. But apart from that, or a theory of inspiration that guarantees history, I don't see how to get a hold of this. So at one point I quote Origen, and I've quoted that line from Origen over and over again because people just don't get it. If something happened, that's no reason to think you can show it happened. And if something didn't happen, that's no reason to think you can show it didn't. History is full of singular claims, and you simply can't get hold of them, right? If you don't have multiple
you don't have
witnesses,
repeatable experiments.
Yeah, so I think with regard to, let's say, the resurrection and the crucifixion, I think there's enough data that we can do some reconstruction here. I don't see it with an event like that. So it's not that I'm a skeptic who says nothing weird could ever happen or miracles don't take place. It's just, if I'm playing by the rules of an historian, I look at that and say, I can't do anything with it. Just, that's it.
Fair enough. Okay. I'll let the next person in line go.
All right. Now, the long awaited for Ken Daniels.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, I feel like I've been put up on a pedestal or something by some in the room. But anyway, I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Allison, for joining our group where none of us are going to be your friends in terms of points of view. The atheists will not side with you, and the fundamentalists in the room won't side with you. And that's most of us. We're either mostly atheists or mostly fundamentalists. So I appreciate the courage it took to come here. If indeed you knew that was the situation you're stepping into. And as an unbeliever, I appreciate your candor and your integrity and not trying to make excuses for some of Jesus' shortcomings. And for example, his mistaken prediction that the Son of Man would return in his generation. And in your book, you wrote, we should treat the Gospels the same way we treat Genesis. We should use them, first of all, not to reconstruct the past, but to construe our world. So my question would be, why should we do that? Why should we use those writings to construe our world if we can't rely on them to reconstruct the past?
Okay.
But I have just like Daniel, I have several questions, but you can stop and answer that if you want.
Okay.
But,
so at that
was my
point,
first.
so this book was not written to the world. This book's actually addressed to people within the churches who accept certain rules and certain traditions and so on. So within that world, that's what we have to do with these texts. If you're outside of the world, of course, there's no reason at all to do this. Okay, so for me, these texts are part of the resources of a tradition to which I belong. And I can't judge their utility on the basis of what I, as an historian, make of them in terms of what happened and didn't happen. So that's all I meant by that. That's in club language. Okay.
Right. And that's good because it's a segue into my next question. It's very related. And so that question is your embrace of Christianity based on a conviction that its tenets are true and good in ways that other religions are not? Or is it simply the strand of spirituality you happen to find yourself in, one vehicle of many that ultimately arrives at a similar destination to others? And is it a better vehicle or a club, as you put it, than others? And as a corollary, is apologetics, which seeks to convince others that one religion is superior to others, a worthy enterprise?
Okay, so there are a million questions there, and I do not say much about other religions in my classroom or in my books because I personally don't think I know enough about them. I study them, but I don't know them as an insider. So for me, Christianity is probably two things. So it's not a creed that I believe. It's not 6 beliefs for me. Christianity is first of all people I have known and people I know through books, people I know through history. There are people I love, people who have spoken to me, people I think are wise, people who have helped me live my life. And that's the first thing I think of when I think of Christianity. I think of Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. I think of things in Gregory of Nyssa. I think of things in Pascal, things that have shaped me, made me who I am, and so on, as well as people I have known who were saintly or wonderful, and shaped my life. So that's the first thing. Christianity is people, or a collection of people who have called themselves Christians. Secondly, Christianity for me is a bunch of competing and conflicting philosophies and traditions and theologians. I mean, if you look at them, if you look at my heroes, my theological heroes, and put them in the room, they would disagree about all sorts of things. So for me, Christianity is a collection of people and books and memories and history. And a lot of it's terrible, and a lot of it I don't like, but a lot of it speaks to me and helps me construct my world in a meaningful way. Now, that all sounds very subjective, right? And I suppose that's in part why I'm not a traditional apologist. I don't think as an historian I can show you this or that. If the philosophers, I'm open-minded. If the philosophers can show me that some teleological argument works, that's fine. That's great. I'll get on board if they can do that. But that's how I think about this thing. I don't think of it as boiled down to 6 propositions that I believe and that I can somehow prove. It's this great big buffet of many wonderful things mixed in with the things that aren't so wonderful.
So you wouldn't consider yourself necessarily an Orthodox with a little O Christian in terms of like belief in the Nicene Creed on the surface value of the Nicene Creed. Would you embrace that, or would you not?
So that's a really interesting question. So I say the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed when we say them at church, and when I say them, I'm always wondering, what do I mean by that? How should I interpret that? Some of it's very easy, and I say, oh yeah, that's okay, I got that one. But what do I really mean when I'm uttering it? Can I do that in a good conscience, and so on? So there's always an internal dialogue that's going on, but it's the same dialogue that it's going on when I read the Bible or interpret the Bible. It's, what does that mean? What do I make of it? How do I move from that text to my own life? Is this something I should jettison, or is this something that I can reinterpret, or can I take this just as it is? So it's a dialogue with all these things. As far as other religions go, my son is focusing on philosophy of religion, and when he figures things out, he will tell me, and then I will know what to believe. Until then, I'm just sitting back. I'm half serious.
Yeah, that's good. But we've had guests in our club. I'm thinking specifically of Tim McGrew. He's a Western Michigan State University philosophy professor, and we asked him about you, and he knew a little bit about you, and he flat out says, yeah, I don't think he's a Christian because he's something about humane thoughts about miracles and things like that. In other words, he was accusing you of being a humane, and
that's absurd.
That's
absurd.
I'm wanting to kind of get your take on that and how you would defend yourself or answer a charge like that.
Well, you're asking about the question of miracles?
Well, that and just any charge that makes you out to not be a true Christian.
Well, look, I don't. Guess I have to be careful here. This is public. Okay. There's a really interesting video by his wife, who is also a philosopher, by Tim McGrew's wife, who's also a philosopher, and she clearly intensely dislikes what my book on the resurrection, thinks it's completely wrong-headed, but I think she completely misrepresents it. So I don't know why they're unable to understand what I say, but that book is not humane at all in any form. It's anti-humane. So I don't understand it one bit.
Well, I think it maybe comes from the perspective that anybody who doesn't adhere 100% to the teachings of the Bible and perhaps inerrancy, I think there's a question as to whether McGrew embraces inerrancy or not. But that basically he would perceive anybody who conducts historical research like you and dismisses certain miraculous aspects of the Bible as only doing it for philosophical reasons. In other words, that you have a bias against miracles in a sense.
So if he thinks that, he's mistaken without any question. I don't appreciate people judging my Christianity, I must say. I don't even understand it. It's not my place to decide what people are, especially if they say they are something.
Well, here's the bottom line deal is we had him here and Ken asked him, he goes, that after Jesus was resurrected, you have two contradictory accounts. In Matthew, he goes to Galilee, and in Luke, he stays in Jerusalem. So instead of embracing the tension, saying, well, I'm not sure, he has to go. Do you see what I'm saying? And by the way, how do you address that? Because this is the resurrection. This is crucial to your faith. How do you embrace these discrepancies of Galilee and Jerusalem?
So my best guess is that the first appearances were in Galilee, and that the Gospels of John and Luke have moved them back to Jerusalem. Luke, for reasons I think are clear. I'm not quite sure why John is doing this. But again, this is how I think about things, and this is how history works. And by gosh, this is how everyday life works. People tell stories all the time. And if I'm there, I can see, oh, okay, that's roughly what happened, but some exaggeration is there. This happens all the time. I don't expect anything to be spot on, right? And I expect, I mean, part of history, anyone who's an historian knows that eyewitnesses contradict themselves all the time. So that's one of the reasons that I don't pay any attention to harmonizers, and why I'm interested in general ideas and basic events that could underlie, whatever traditions that we have. So I don't harmonize them. I think the best explanation is that Galilee is the more primitive idea.
Yeah. Dr. Allison, I have a question for you. Given Dr. McGrew's response and words, how would you define what constitutes a quote unquote real Christian?
I wouldn't. I simply wouldn't do that. It's not my place to do that. My least favorite verse, maybe in the New Testament, is Paul's line that the saints will judge the world. I have no interest in participating in such a event. Zero. So, look, that's up to God, or however it works. It's not up to me.
So like, even if somebody was like, I don't know, like an adherent to Hare Krishna, but obviously I'm picking like, the wildest, illustration I can, that they, they're part of Hare Krishna, but yet at the same time, they want to identify as Christian. You wouldn't say, well, hey, you really don't accept the Christ of the Bible. I mean, you're following Krishna. Yeah, at best, Jesus is an avatar.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, that's the problem. So for Hare Krishna, Krishna is actually the same word as Christos. They have an etymology that links these two. It's not correct historically, but Hare Krishnas are like George Harrison, who thought Jesus, as you said, was an avatar or a manifestation of the supreme deity. So I don't have. I guess I should. I'm not only not an apologist, I'm not really an evangelist. So I like to talk to people. I've never had the chance to sit down with Hare Krishna. I'd be happy to talk and discuss things and debate this or that, but I'm not interested. Let's put it this way: I'm not a missionary. Okay, I'm not a missionary. My chief interest is in understanding other people, and I leave people in the hands of God. No, that's not the way to put it. I don't leave them in the hand. They are in the hands of God, and it has nothing to do with me.
Okay.
And
all right,
so piggybacking on that, I did have one last thing in my list of questions that I posted in the Slack or in the channel, and that was, what do you believe about the fate of non-believers like me? Will I simply be worm food, or will I have a form of consciousness after death? And if so, what should I expect in your view?
Okay, so I don't know exactly what's going to happen to you, but I am with David Bentley Hart on this, and I have a book out called Night Comes, and there is a chapter on hell. And I suppose at the end of the day, I'm a happy universalist. That doesn't mean I don't believe in some interpretation of hell, but I'm with Origen on this one. So I don't know what happens to all of us, so to speak, in the middle state. but I am sure God wins in the end, and I personally think that must include everybody. So I know that must be very controversial in this sort of context. But if any of you know David Bentley Hart's work on this, I'm in the same camp, and he actually blurbed my book on death, where I present my own view on this.
Dale, I have a question. Oh,
I wish you well, Ken. I wish you well.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I'm sympathetic to Christianity. I just don't think it's, I grew up in a very conservative environment. I became a missionary. And so I was trained to see things in very binary terms. You're either in or you're out. And it didn't seem to be much of a point to me in holding on to something if it's not objectively true in some sense. So that's why I kind of just jumped out, and yet I see value in some of what you're doing. I just don't know that I can see it as somehow objectively aligning with reality. But I do like the community that you're a part of, and the kind of the discussions and the cogitations and the work, the good works, and those types of things. I wish I could be part of a community like that. I feel a real lack as a non-believer. And I know there's some communities of non-believers out there, and I've tried them out. They just don't. I don't have an affinity with them, but I have more of an affinity with, that's why I come to this group, because there's people that actually care about the things that I've always cared about and interested in. So
we love you, Ken.
I have this longing, but I don't, I just don't see the truth in it.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate sharing. We always miss Ken when he's not here. It's not always the same club. It is. So Ken is good. We appreciate you, Ken. Thank you for sharing. Dale, I have a historical theological question that maybe might take 2 hours to unpack, but take it or leave it for what you want. I have, the passage in Paul in the First Corinthians, his first epistle to the Corinthians, the 15th chapter, of course. And he says, and I'll just be brief here. He says, "Now, if Christ is preached that he has been raised from the dead, how do some among you say there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. Your faith also is in vain. Moreover, we are found to be false witnesses of God, because we testified against God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if in fact the dead are not raised." So maybe a theological and historian perspective on Paul's exhortation to these poor Corinthians who are struggling with the idea of the resurrection centuries ago. What would you say as a theologian? What would you say as a historian about those words of Paul?
Well, so if you know anything about the secondary literature on 1 Corinthians 15, you will know that one of the great questions is, what the heck is Paul addressing? That is, what is it that the Corinthians believed? Because Paul preached Jesus crucified and raised from the dead. And if they converted at his hearing, then what on earth are they objecting to, because they must have accepted the resurrection in the first place? So you have this debate. Is it that the Corinthians have become ecstatics and they're into a realized eschatology, and so they're not looking forward to the future? Or is it that they've just reverted back to the Greek idea that souls ascend, but bodies are left behind? What is going on here? We don't know. It's exceedingly frustrating. If I had to guess, but this is a guess. And so going back to the earlier question, maybe this is Sean's point, but this is right in the middle, 50-50. I don't really know how to figure this out. But one possibility is that when Paul preached that Jesus was risen from the dead, they could accept it because Jesus was in the tomb only for a day or two. And there were certainly stories, of Hercules and others that might be transfigured instantly. But in any case, the point would be that event is completely unlike somebody sitting in a tomb for 50 years and then becoming rotting bones and flesh. So that what they're not objecting to Jesus. That makes sense. The guy rose very quickly. They're rejecting to the idea of decomposed bodies sort of being raised and walking around and being a mess. So if that's what Paul is doing, then he's saying, no, the things that come out aren't, bones and rotted flesh and so on, but they're transfigured and so on. Look, theologically, you just have two options here. One, there is something like a soul, and or if there is a resurrection of the dead, it's got to involve some sort of radical transformation, whether that involves earthly matter or something else. So it seems to me Paul is on to something because he's emphasizing discontinuity. So theologically, I would go there. I think he may be answering a position which is presupposing way too much continuity between what's in the grave and what comes out of the grave. Did that make sense?
I understand how you're perceiving it.
Okay.
Yeah. The latter part of that verse, which I didn't read, was about Paul addressing, if Christ has not been raised, you are still in your sins, which take us back to Adam. And I think it was Bill at the beginning who talked about, if there's no Adam, this idea of being in our sin seems to be textually hagitic. What is Paul talking about if there's no Adam? Literally, is this something? What do you see as a historian there? Because I think it's in your book where you had said something about Adam not being historical or mytho-historical or something like that.
Yeah.
I was just wondering what you think Paul is saying here in light of there being no Adam. I know you said earlier that Paul believed there was an Adam, but you're saying there is no Adam, or I think you're saying there is no Adam. What is that for me today, who is a Christian, who maybe some people might consider me a fundamentalist? If there's no Adam, I'm still in my sin. If what you're saying is true, you see what I'm saying? I'm trying to understand your historical perspective and how it might impact me as a believer.
Okay, so yeah, we're having a communication breakdown here.
Okay.
So what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 15 is that he's thinking of Christ in terms of Adam. And so Christ becomes the last Adam, and he becomes the Redeemer figure. And then he's in contrast to the first Adam, right? So what do you lose theologically if his contrast is with a literary figure as opposed to an historical figure? That, I guess that would be the question that the modern theologian would ask you.
Yeah. What am I as a Christian losing if there's only a literary Adam and not a physical Adam through which I've inherited sin? That's what the impact for me today in terms of your historical perspective on Adam. That's what I was asking. Yeah,
that's the answer. So you could think of it this way. Paul does have a literary figure in mind, but he assumes it's historical. The modern liberal theologian could simply say, okay, he was wrong about the historical, but he is thinking of Christ in terms of this literary figure, and it still makes sense. It's a typology that works. No matter how sin came into the world historically or actually, Christ is the undoing of that.
So there is, despite the fact that you only accept a literary Adam, do you accept the reality of sin as Scripture is describing it?
Okay, so I'm not sure, again, I guess I'm going to alienate some people. I'm not sure that there is a doctrine of sin in the Bible. But do I think people are sinful? Heck, yes. Do I think we are a mess? Yes. Do I think we need help? Yes. These are all obvious things to me, right? I think wasn't it Chesterton who said this is one doctrine? I mean, you don't need the Bible for this doctrine, right? All you need to do is look around.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you for your answer. Thank you. Brady, do we have somebody else lined up? I know I don't want to take Phil. Did you want to? Phil, you haven't said anything tonight.
Well, Phil go first, and I'll wait.
Did you have a question, Phil? Oh, no?
No,
Phil does not have a question. Okay.
James, if you'll jump in.
Yeah. Let me I've got a quote here from Bill Craig that is a little lengthy, but I think it's worth the quote. It's about your other work, Resurrecting Jesus. And then I had some questions on that. So William Lane Craig says, Dale Allison's essay, Resurrecting Jesus, is one of the most impressive pieces of work I have read in this well-plowed field. His treatment is commendable for its candor, both about his proclivities towards belief in the physical resurrection and his philosophical misgivings about it, for its rigorous argument, and especially for its dazzling scholarly erudition. One is duly impressed by the fine New Testament scholars' evidences a thorough mastery of the literature in his field pertinent to the subject, but is especially impressive when he begins to cite literature and philosophy relevant to the problems of personal identity and material constitution, and in psychology and in parapsychology concerning bereavement visions, collective hallucinations, and the like. And then he says this, he says, Allison forced me, as no one else has, to rethink the evidence for Jesus's resurrection afresh. Indeed, I have never seen a more persuasive case for skepticism about the historicity of Jesus's resurrection than in Allison's presentation of the arguments. He is far more persuasive than Crossan, Luderman, and he goes on to list. But he says this at the end, that Allison should, despite his skeptical arguments, finally affirm the facts of Jesus's burial, empty tomb, post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus's resurrection, and hold that the resurrection hypothesis is as viable an explanation of any other. He goes on to say, despite the fact that you make, in his opinion, the best case not to believe in a resurrection, nevertheless, you end up believing in a resurrection. So now he quibbles, he goes on in here and talks about, physical versus spiritual and things like that. But I don't want our club to miss the point that with all the persuasive arguments, even on the resurrection itself, the bottom line is you end up believing in a resurrection of sorts. And that is your position, correct?
Yeah, that is my position. You read those very nice things by Bill Craig. He went on not to be so nice.
He gets into the difference between physical versus spiritual, and he does quibble on that and stuff like that. But I don't want everybody to miss the bigger picture, and that is that you come down not on the side of atheism or agnosticism, but you come down on the side of the historicity of the resurrection. Now, and if you could explain maybe how what you believe about the resurrection is maybe different from more traditional or historical forms of Christianity, that would be good as well. But I just wanted to make that real clear. You believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, maybe in a different way, but it goes far beyond, the best I can tell, that Jesus merely rose again in the hearts and the memories of his disciples.
No, yes, I certainly believe in more than that. In a couple of places, the way I've put this is the disciples saw Jesus and Jesus saw them. So I've tried to make that clear. But then, so, what I could do is I could just be a creedal Christian and say I have to defend the creed, the one that I say in church. But I have to be honest, and the empty tomb just puzzles me. So as an historian, I've actually argued in that book, in the more recent one, that as an historian, I think the best explanation of the data is that the tomb was empty, or the tomb was probably empty. All right. So I say that. And then I go ahead and say that if I were a skeptic, I would argue for tomb robbery, because I think that's the way to go if I'm a skeptic, but I'm not a skeptic. But at the end of the day, I just don't know what to do with the risen body. So there are philosophical issues here. I don't think when I die that I need a risen body. I expect to go somewhere else. I'm actually in some ways a dualist, even though I know there are grave philosophical questions about such a thing, but I am a convinced dualist. And so I do not think my life requires this body, all right? And I don't think most of the traditional Christian ideas of heaven demand a body. So the body puzzles me, or why you can't have a new body. That doesn't bother me at all. That's fine if you have to do that. But it's just a personal philosophical puzzle. just don't know what to do with it. I don't know what happened to it. I don't know what it means. So Martin Luther at one point said, well, Christ rose from his body just to convince the disciples he was alive. But when he ascended to heaven, he just sloughed it off because he didn't need it. All right. So Luther doesn't understand it theologically, except as a sort of proof to the disciples. All right. And I have the same problem. I wanted Jesus who is a spirit. I wanted Jesus, Jesus lives in my heart. I want to be able to say that. I don't know how I do that with a guy who's like Calvin thinks he's in outer space somewhere, literally sitting on a chair. That I just don't get that.
So you do believe in the post-resurrection appearances, like Jesus with the fish fry at the Sea of Tiberias? Is that historical?
No, I don't think that one is. Okay.
How about Road to Emmaus?
Pardon? Road to Emmaus. I've been agnostic. I don't know the origin of that story. So, that's very frustrating, isn't it? But that story in particular, Bultmann thought it had an ancient feeling to it, and a number of other people have, and I just can't get my hand on it. I don't think it's Luke's invention. I think it's a tradition, but I don't know how to pin it down. Just don't know how.
And some people, like Richard Carrier, says that all roads lead to Rome, or whereas in the Christian version of Road to Emmaus, all roads lead back out of Jerusalem. Contrasted to all roads lead to Rome. So okay. But here's the problem.
Hey, skeptic, Bill, we need to
post-resurrection appearances.
Bill, we need to get back around to Peter. We skipped over Peter, and we're almost we almost lost him. So Peter, you're up, bud. Sorry about that.
Well, I'm not a scholar by any stretch, and I just consider myself a hard cider drinking disciple of Jesus. Now, it's in that context, but there are veins and things, and there's a set of words that I want to ask a question about, which is the Gospels are anonymous. Now, when I hear that most of the time, the initial is they aren't signed. They don't have a signature in those texts. But it also, every time I hear that, the implication is we don't know who authored them. We never know, in question or otherwise. And all I can do is draw conclusions from the data we have and everything else. And so my question is, first and second century text data, is there any text that says anything close to, we don't know who authored these texts that say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
No,
because I don't know any.
No, well, there aren't any. Okay.
And so isn't this at its core an argument from silence?
Okay, so
I'm saying we still have to come to conclusions, but the conclusion that these people, we don't know who these authors are, that's art. How do you I'm grappling with there's an argument from silence, so people fill in the blanks.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know what blank they would fill in there. So what usually happens in higher critical scholarship, and this is what Bart Ehrman, I think, would do if he were here. Bart would say, well, the evidence in Matthew is against being written by an eyewitness, so the title has to be late and secondary. And he would argue the same thing with the Gospel of John. It looks like a late text. It can't be from an eyewitness. He would probably say Luke can't be written by Luke because if you read Acts, that couldn't have been written by a companion of Paul, so that one is false. So you see the move that they would make. They would take the titles and then they would say, okay, there's evidence against them. But you are right, there's no evidence that anyone ever thought, hey, we don't know who wrote this. Okay, that's true. And
And that doesn't mean these are the people that wrote them, but there isn't this direct or question text anywhere. We don't know who wrote these.
No, and when they appear, they all have titles with them. Okay, they don't appear anonymously. The argument is that this gets very complicated. I'll just say this: there are scholars such as Martin Hingel or Simon Gathercole who made arguments recently that the titles or some form of the titles might be original. Okay, I don't know that they're wrong, so I'm agnostic about that. But I'm in the middle with authorship. I think the tradition about Mark could be correct. I think the tradition about Luke is probably correct. I think the tradition about Matthew is wrong. And I think the tradition about John, I think John is the beloved disciple, but I think the text has developed a great deal from the original testimony of somebody who knew Jesus. So I'm in sort of the middle here, right? I'm not dismissing all this stuff, but I'm not accepting all four titles as they are. I think they have to be taken one by one and examined. But you are right. Nobody says we don't know who wrote these. And by the way, also, you have to ask this: did a text ever appear and was it read in church and nobody ever said who wrote this or where it was from or give a title? That's an odd thing to do. So I suspect there were traditions associated with these from the very beginning, even if there was no title attached. I find it very difficult to say, okay, we're going to read it from a gospel today. We don't know who wrote it. It just sort of appeared in our community. Let's read it. I find that doubtful. So there has to be some tradition attached to these things. And as I say, Mark and Luke make sense to me as they stand. I think the other two, a lot more needs to be said.
Phil, do you want to unmute and fire away? Phil Bear, go ahead, sir.
Hi, Dale.
Hi.
In his book, Reasonable Faith, William Lane Craig dealt with the question of whether or not there's such a thing as an indisputable historical fact. Do you think there's such a thing as an indisputable historical fact?
So, indisputable. Well, are you asking, are there facts that, as a matter of fact, nobody disputes? Because the answer to that would be yes, right? So John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963. As far as I know, that's an indisputable fact. Correct?
Well, for me, the term indisputable doesn't mean nobody disputes it. It means it's not able to be disputed. That's what indisputable means. So is there anything that can be established objectively as an indisputable historical fact to the point where it's impossible to dispute it on any rational or evidential grounds?
Okay, and my example of the Kennedy assassination didn't work for you? So maybe I'm misunderstanding something.
I'm just addressing your distinction between whether or not no one has disputed it or whether or not it's something cannot be disputed on its face.
Okay, well, I guess I'm not getting the distinction. Forgive me. I'm being foggy here.
Dale, I think he wants a fact in the New Testament. Is that right, Phil? You want something you can solid in the New Testament you can believe in?
No, I'm not necessarily talking about the New Testament. I'm trying to drive to a principle, because I think that in a lot of modern scholarship, there has been an adoption of a philosophy that I refer to as radical historical skepticism.
Right.
And it entails the rejection of the idea, number one, that there's such a thing as an indisputable historical fact. And number two, it entails the rejection of the idea that eyewitness testimony can be reliable enough to establish a fact that is beyond reasonable doubt. And there are other kind of salient principles that are involved in this idea. And when I see a lot of the skepticism about the reliability of the New Testament, so yeah, in a way, Bill, I am alluding to the New Testament, but I'm not alluding to any particular claim in the New Testament.
But what Dale's saying is you've got to parse it out. Like Jesus being baptized by John, I'm sure Dale would say that is an indisputable. Would you say that's an indisputable fact of history?
I'd say it's a fact that's unreasonable to doubt.
There you go. Say, hey, you can have a good faith there, Phil. Or
so is that what you're after, Phil?
Yeah, to a degree. What I'm really after is I'm after the approach that people take to analyzing and investigating the historicity of the New Testament or any other ancient document, or even recent history, for that matter. That there are two approaches that I see, and I see a new approach that is a departure from what I think is a more traditional approach. And the new approach I see is approach of radical skepticism. And that radical skepticism denies the possibility that there can be such a thing as a reliable eyewitness testimony, regardless of how far back it goes. John Loftus does this quite a bit. He says human testimony is completely worthless. And that's an expression of what I see as radical historical skepticism. And so that what approach you're going to take to the New Testament is going to determine whether or not, is going to determine the outcome on its face. And the problem that I see is that I have never seen anyone defend the validity of this radical skepticism before. And the second thing that I've seen is that this radical skepticism that even includes the idea that human memory is unreliable also diminishes and practically obliterates the whole endeavor of science along with history. So that's kind of what prompted my question. Is there such a thing as an indisputable historical fact? Because this radical skepticism would say no.
Okay, so I don't know why this is addressed to me. I'm not a radical skeptic. I think we know lots of things about Jesus. I think we know lots of things from the ancient world. I think we know lots of things about history in general. I think that eyewitnesses are often right, but I think eyewitnesses sometimes get things wrong, so you have to examine them critically. Everybody knows that from modern court cases, but I'm not a radical skeptic. My way of approaching this through the memory studies, which I have read, and I've read a lot, is that human memory is pretty reliable, at least when it comes to the big things, or what's called the gist of an event, or it often gets small things wrong, but that doesn't make me at all a skeptic. If I were a skeptic, I wouldn't have written. I'm now writing, I don't know, my fourth book on Jesus. I've said a lot about Jesus. That means I'm not a skeptic. I think we can know a lot of things about him, and know a lot of things from the Gospels, and know a lot of things about first century Christianity. So,
yeah. Well, I'm not necessarily impugning skepticism by itself, because we should all be skeptics, right? We should always approach things critically, and we should always come up with a critical analysis of any historical narrative or any historical eyewitness account or whatever it happens to be. I'm just seeing a lot of an epistemological bias that has been introduced into a lot of modern study, and that bias is pointing to the idea that you can't even accept any human testimony. And I don't hear that bias from you, but I wanted to kind of reinforce the idea that I think William Lane Craig argues for very strongly in his book, And that is that there is such a thing as an indisputable historical fact. And part of what he has to say about it is that if there's no such thing as an indisputable historical fact, then science is just as unreliable as history is, because science relies on human testimony just as strongly as history does.
Okay. So I'm not sure that I disagree with anything there, except that I think I'd want to put your comments within a larger historical perspective. So I think skepticism actually gets started during the Renaissance and Reformation, especially with Protestants who look at all the stories about Catholic saints and Catholic miracles and end up with very critical responses to them, saying, well, I don't think that happened. I don't think that statue of Mary moved, and so on and so on and so on. So skepticism towards religious events is actually, during the Enlightenment, picked up from Protestants who have become cessationists. That is, they believe in miracles in the New Testament, but after that, the last 1,000 years, they're all bogus. So there is a critical spirit introduced there. And what happens is the Protestant idea of cessationism gets expanded to include the Bible, so it includes everything. And that then in turn leads to us. I think that's all excessive, but I think if we're going to be fair, even if we're Protestants, we need to say, yeah, we helped hatch this excessive skepticism.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Dale, very much.
Thank you.
So next month, we have a guest author. We're going to be meeting on August 4th, the first Thursday, same time, same channel. It'll be Zoom only. And our guest author is Sarah Salviander. And we're going to be looking at a chapter that she wrote in a book we've looked at maybe a couple of years ago, The Story of the Cosmos. And this was, of course, co-edited by our own Daniel Ray. And she's going to be talking about a chapter. Let me give you background on Sarah. Dr. Salviander is an astrophysicist who studies extreme deep space phenomena, things like quasars, supermassive black holes, giant galaxies. She was a researcher at the Department of Astronomy at the University of Texas at Austin for 16 years, 9 of those years as a post-PhD research fellow. In August of 2017, she retired from her position at UT to focus on ministry work. She was raised atheist in a secular country of Canada, but came to know God and Jesus Christ in large part through her scientific work. In July of 2005, halfway through her graduate studies, she was baptized as a Christian. In chapter 6 of The Story of the Cosmos, she tells that story. And the chapter is called God, Black Holes, and the End of the Universe. So Thursday, August 4th, Thursday, we're going to be looking at chapter 6 of the book, The Story of the Cosmos. And again, if you check out atheistchristianbookclub.com and go to next meeting, we have links to the book. We usually have video, YouTube alternatives. If you don't have time to finish the book, you can go to watch the YouTube clips as well. And
James, really I put the link to her video chapter in the notes in our chat.
It's in our chat right now as well. So you're going to really love to hear from Dr. Salviander, and I'm looking forward to that as well. Let me shut this down here. And there we go. So something I was earlier this week at Starbucks, actually reading your book, Dale, and in my subconscious, there's a music playing, and it was halfway through when I realized it was Give Me Love by George Harrison. And so I'm reading the book and I'm hearing this, and he says something, keep me free from birth. And so it broke my concentration. I'm thinking, is he thinking about free from the karmic cycle of reincarnation? What does he mean free? What does it mean to be free from birth? And I look at the book, I'm thinking, well, I'm going to be talking to the guy who's going to know the answer to that question. So I don't know if you really do or not. But
I really do it. No, of course. Yes. He wants to be free from birth. He does not want to be stuck in a karmic cycle. And so he wants to escape and go on to a better world.
What's the name of your book? Tell us the name of the book on George Harrison.
The Love There That's Sleeping. The Life and Music of George Harrison.
Yes. And so I guessed correctly that he was talking about being
Yes.
free from reincarnation.
Yes, he was a convinced Hindu.
Some of the members of the book club, we took a field trip to Kalakanji's in downtown Dallas, which is a 5-star rated vegetarian restaurant run by the Hare Krishnas. We visited their temple. They gave us a really cool lecture, let us sit through some of the chanting, and they still have prominent some books and pictures and stuff of George Harrison. I think some of the other Beatles may become disenchanted with, maybe not the Krishnas, but certainly with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, but maybe not so much George Harrison. He died still a believer in Eastern.
Yes, he did. And in fact, at one point, he volunteered to become a Hare Krishna and to give up his marriage and the whole bit. And he was told that he was a better messenger if he stayed on the outside world and, spoke to people through his music and lived a normal life. So he was very sincere about it.
Well, I've not read your book and all, but just in a sentence, could you tell me what can a Christian learn from the spirituality of George Harrison?
Well, I say in that book that one of the things that attracted me to George was that even though he's a Hindu and I'm a Christian, I found a lot in common between us. And so that piqued my interest and I wanted to explore it. In addition to the fact that I've always just been a Beatles fan and a George fan and loved the music, and my publisher asked me to write the book. But there's a lot of exploration of his spirituality, and it's driven in part by the question somebody asked earlier about what I think of other religions, and trying to get inside somebody else's head who belongs to a different tradition, and where do we agree and disagree, and how do I feel about what's going on here with this guy. So I found it a really interesting entree into modern syncretistic Hinduism. And I happen to like George. I think most celebrities, I'm sure if you met them, they'd be jerks. I like to think that he might have been a nice guy to sit down and chat with. I came away with a good impression. I don't have a good impression about John Lennon, but I came away with a good impression of George doing all my research.
Well,
I think
thank
the
you
same
so
is
much.
true of you, having you in this meeting. You've met all of our expectations and exceeded them. I think you're a nice guy, and we appreciate you. It's a breath of fresh air to have a kind of in-between perspective represented here in our club.
Okay.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Ken. I think I speak for all of us atheists and Christians. We really appreciate you sharing with us and taking our questions. And it was a different perspective than either side, really. But I think both sides learned a lot of things tonight. I want to thank you so much for being part. Any parting words of wisdom for the atheists and the Christians? I
don't have wisdom, but everybody should buy my new book. Publish. Everything's being farmed out today. Everything is now through technology being farmed out to us. And I've discovered that book publicity is also being farmed out.
That's
so
right.
It's just terrible. And now I've become somebody who hawks my books, right? Hawks my wares. Anyway, I really like this book. It's not on Jesus, but it is on religion. So
what's the title?
It's called Encountering Mystery, and it just came out. It's with Erdmans.
Okay.
And yeah, you should have me back. Okay.
Okay, that's what I was going to say. So if we all buy the book, maybe we could talk you into coming back up and sitting through a 2-hour torturous questions that difficult questions, but you did a great job of answering. Thank you so much for being part of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. See you guys next month. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dale.
Thanks.
The Atheist and Christian Book Club is a production of Watchman Fellowship Incorporated, Arlington, Texas. For more information about our ministry, you can visit watchman.org. And if you would like to join us live for a book club meeting, link in at watchman.org/Zoom. That's watchman.org/Zoom. You can watch and listen, or you can ask a question or two of the authors we feature. See our website, the atheistchristianbookclub.com, for more information, or watch past club meetings right here on our club YouTube page. For the Atheist and Christian Book Club and Watchman Fellowship, I'm Daniel Ray. We'll see you next month.